Welcome to Codford. Codford is situated between Warminster and Salisbury. I'm here to tell you the hidden history behind this small and historic village. The village was created from two parishes of Codford St Mary and Codford St Peter. The village of Codford was an army village that helped the injured soldiers and trained the new recruits during the First and Second World War. The carefully maintained war cemetery nearby is the second largest in the UK and contains the graves of 66 New Zealanders, 97 Anzac troops and 31 Australians, plus one Welsh Guardsman. All troops are from World War I and World War II. The effects of two world wars still can be seen in the local community, and there is still a sense of welcoming towards both Australians and New Zealanders. Codford villagers hold a remembrance ceremony for all of the troops lost in the battles in both World War I and World War II. We hold this Remembrance Day on the 25th of April each year. We call this Anzac Day.
If we look at, for instance, the First World War, we know that by September 1914, just after war was declared, 24,000 of Kitchener's new troops actually came to Codford here. The roads were not made up, they didn't have any huts built, so the men were under canvas while they were building. The rain came down very early and flooded the place, and so there were men laying in their tents listening to the rain fall down because they didn't have the right kind of boots. They couldn't just go walking out anywhere, and quite a lot of the time they just spent time laying on their beds being very, very fed up. The village itself, there were two villages then, Codford St Mary and Codford St Peter, divided in the middle where Cherry Orchard is today, and these villages were suddenly overtaken by a tremendous amount of troops. Now the first thing to say is, rather if you think of a gold rush town in America or in Australia, the fact was you have all these troops, the villagers are here, and the troops need certain services, and so along the high street especially, little booths would be built outside the houses in some instances for the barbers, the bicycle shop, there was all sorts of things. So different little booths sprung up by actually in front of the houses in the high street and along where the playing field is today. The troops were not very happy in some instances. They got really fed up with Codford because apart from anything else, you can just imagine all the troops come here. We didn't have all that many young ladies. So there was a great shortage of female companionship, young girls to take out. And in addition to that, when the rain came down, the whole of St Mary's was flooded, as it does occasionally in very bad weather today. And what actually happened was that the men were walking on duckboards. At this time, this was a time that was very good for the history of Codford in that, in the First World War, photography was very much the in thing. And the soldiers wanted pictures of themselves to send home to their families. And so there's a tremendous amount of photographs of Codford in the First World War, which are readily available, which is really good because it gives us an idea of exactly what it looked like. But the troops obviously didn't like it when it was raining very much, and they called it things like the Drain, Codford on the Mud, and Mudford. So they called it quite rude names at times. But they were here for obviously quite a period of time, and we had the British troops, but then in about 1916 we have Codford turning into a New Zealand command depot. And a command depot was a new thing at this time. It was a training camp as well for troops from Australia, New Zealand, and of course from Britain. There was a hospital here for the New Zealanders. They took over the Red Cross hospital, and it was the main dental hospital for all the New Zealanders in Britain. But in addition to that, the soldiers, there was actually VD shelters up there, as well as TB shelters. VD was seen to be a self-inflicted disease, and most of the troops that came from the Antipodes, as it were, managed to get the disease on leave in London. So, and any one time, quite a large number of soldiers in World War I would have actually some kind of sexually transmitted disease. And they were in trouble for this because it was seen as being self-inflicted. And so it was more like a prison camp atmosphere around this. And there were pretty stringent ways in which they would treat this. And one of the ways, for instance, if you felt as if this would relate to gonorrhea, if you felt as if you were peeing hot shingles, they would tell you to take your shoes off and walk on cold cobbles. Now, I'm not quite sure how much use that would be, not a lot. There's a wonderful story which I found when I was doing research about books, my book for the Second World War, and that was a story about the First World War and a prostitute who comes and is servicing the Australian troops. She gives one of them VD. The soldier concerned knocked her on the head, threw her down a well on Manor Farm, and presumably she's still there. One only hopes that the well wasn't in use, because a prostitute with syphilis in a well is not necessarily a very good taste. So Codford, very, very active during that First World War. Obviously, when the war ends, the troops go away, but the last of the troops, the Australian troops especially, left in 1919. There were a couple of reasons that it was a very useful, Codford was a very good place. First of all, it's on a main railway station, and it was on a main line between the coast and Bristol, on the Great Western Railway. So it was very close to a railway. At the same time, it was at the edge of Salisbury Plain, which was a major, and still today is actually, it's the largest military training ground in Europe. And soldiers from all over countries in the world come here to train. So the fact is, it was a big training ground, a very big training area for the troops, and it was owned, it was for military purposes. So that was one of the things. There was a camp railway that went between the camps, and when I tell you that in the Wylye Valley, Codford had 15 camps on its own, and the rest of the Wylye Valley villages had 12 camps between them, you can see how important Codford was. It was known really as the main camp. There was a post office here, and so if, for instance, they were at Stockton or Chitton, very often the post office stamp would say Codford, even if they were in somewhere else, because this was actually the main camp. And it's a bit difficult when you're doing research trying to find out about people, because sometimes people will be listed as coming, say, from Codford or living in Codford, and when you research it, you might find that they live in Stockton down the road, or they live in Chitton, or they live in Wylye. So from that point of view, Codford was a generic name, and it was the centre, but there are other villages actually focused into it as well. But it was a major training camp. In the First World War, the Australians on our hillside carved out a badge, which today we call the Codford Badge, the Australian Rising Sun. Now the fact about that was it was carved on the hillside of what the troops, the Australian and the New Zealanders, called Misery Hill, because they had to go up it with their full packs on, and then when they got to the top they'd have to strip off and they'd have to do exercises at the top. And it's a pretty high place, it's a pretty cold place, and it's a pretty damp place, so they really were pretty fed up with it. Our officer in charge was actually of the Australian troops, was based in Stockton House. He looked at the hillside and he thought it would be a good idea if they cut out the Australian badge.